1 to the City Council's Legislative Subcommittee for Wednesday, August 23rd, 2023, here in Conference of May. I'd look first for approval of the January 27th, 2023 minutes of this meeting.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Oh, and Jane, you did take the roll, or should?
I did not.
Okay, let's take the roll. It's not on here, but
Yep. Mayor McEachran,
here.
Assistant Mayor Kelly,
Here.
Councilor Tabor,
Here.
Councilor Cook,
Here.
Karen Conrad is here, the city manager. I'm here, Senior Assistant City Attorney Jane Forney. Not referring to age, but experience. And we have a representative here who joined us. So thank you so much.
Hey,
Yeah,
David.
David
How are you?
Muse. So he is here to listen in and hear the update. So thanks for coming.
All right. First up, Jane, would you be kind enough to indulge us in the summary of the bills enacted in 2023?
I will. Believe it or not, there is a PowerPoint. Don't
what?
faint,
Wow.
everyone. I know.
Listen, now I know why you're a senior here.
That's right. I'm stepping up my game and doing PowerPoints now.
You and your attorney wouldn't have this.
Most simple of PowerPoints ever viewed by anyone, but at any rate, we can all share. Okay, next screen. So what I did is I took the bills we talked about and kind of gave you a status update on some of those. We talked about, the status when we discussed them, as you all know. Senate Bill 262 was the hotel occupancy, and unfortunately that did not make it out of committee. It was ITL'd. Then there were several bills relative to childcare that I think Councilor Cook was specifically interested in as well. And so Senate Bill 221, that was a study committee to review daycare affordability and access, particularly due to post-COVID issues. And that was retained in committee. But what did pass is Senate Bill 170, which was the one that added some of those smaller definitions of daycares, at-home daycares, to the definition of daycare providers. So that did pass. There were a few housing bills that we were tracking. One that we were specifically interested in was Senate Bill 244, which was as a part of the Housing Opportunity Zone statute. It would have added language that would have allowed municipalities to require 20% of new construction to be workforce housing. That's something, enabling legislation, it would have been optional. Unfortunately, a nice way of killing a bill is to sometimes re-refer or retain it in committee. So it did not make it out, but notwithstanding efforts on behalf of our representatives and Senator Perkins-Coker and our committee members here. So that was the disposition on that one. There was a Senate Bill 47. This was one of several. A lot of times there are kind of statewide zoning amendments, and this was one to look at specifically housing density with the idea of trying to encourage workforce housing. And that one made it all the way to committee of conference and then just didn't make it out of committee of conference. So there was support for that all the way through. It just didn't make it in the end. Okay, next page. Another topic that was very important, and there were lots of bills, were tenants' rights, as a result of COVID and, particularly as a result of the funding for housing drying up through COVID. Most of the bills regarding tenants' rights and notice and all of that died, except for Senate Bill 235. And that created a study committee to consider creating a mediation program for landlord-tenant issues. And so that is significant because I think tenants that have been evicted, having been over at the circuit court and in my former life doing those types of things, it's very confusing for a lot of tenants. The landlord-tenant law is very strict. And so, something like an alternative mediation program may be something that will come out of this committee, and might help tenants and landlords work things out without going to court. And so that obviously passed. There were some relative to, the erosion of local control and some strange liability bills that were introduced this last session. So House Bill 647, which was one we discussed, which was the elimination of certain government immunities, that was tabled. House Bill 292 was a strange bill entitled Theft by a Public Servant, if that public servant paid for legal fees for defending a claim, except if that was approved in some sort of I should have said non-public session on that one. So that was ITL'd right off the bat, which was encouraging. Every year, something similar to House Bill 51 comes forward, restriction on lobbying for municipalities and school districts and the like. That particular bill was ITL'd. And House Bill 361, which was a request to add representatives from Rye and Newcastle to the Pease Board, that was also retained in committee. And then all of the cannabis bills, they went up in smoke, ba-dum-tsh. So,
Nice.
thank you very much. I worked on that all, no, and I'll be appearing in Vegas, no, only kidding. So all of them were either tabled, ITL'd, retained in committee. The one that survived, which is passed as Chapter 237, is one that creates a commission to study state-controlled cannabis and the sale of hemp products, and clarifies a little bit more relative to what the therapeutic cannabis program is in the state. So that passed, and the report out for that committee is due on December 1st. So they don't have a lot of time, but typically those are the dates by which these study committees have to report out. Next page. Retirement, that's something we care a lot about in the city of Portsmouth, like all municipalities, because it affects our budget. So we were very encouraged by House Bill 50 and Senate Bill 114, which would have had the state pay a portion of the employer's contribution for retirement. It was similar to the bill last year, where I think, what was it, 7% or 9%, kind of reinstating the state's former obligation to pay a portion of the employer's retirement contribution. House Bill 50 made it all the way into House Bill 2. So we all thought that was going to, as amended, pass. And what House Bill 50 got amended to was a $50 million to reduce the unfunded accrued liability for the retirement system. Unfortunately, it was removed from House Bill 2 at the last minute, so that did not go forward. And then there are changes relative to retirement eligibility. Statute used to say you could retire at 65. Now, as younger employees have an older retirement date, that language was changed to eligibility for Social Security. So that passed. There's also a cost of living adjustment for retirees. That passed. There was another bill, 555, that was going to, again, portion some of the state surplus towards the accrued liability. That was tabled. And there is a bill that passed relative to penalties if municipalities don't file employer compensation reports relative to retirement. Interestingly, two bills, House Bill 461 and 436, were both retirement bills that are now study committees. The more interesting one from our perspective as far as municipal budgets was House Bill 436 as originally drafted, and that's a bill that would have vested certain police and fire employees, about 1,824 members, that I think fell off the vested cliff when they did the retirement reforms way back. Putting them back in, the bill would have had that cost funded by the state, and that funding would have projected forward for the next 20 years. There was a lot of concern about that bill because you can't, what one legislature passes as a statute, as we all know, can be undone by a subsequent legislature. So the worry about this is, you know, the state might pay the first year or 2 years, and then the next legislature could come in and say, we're waiving that payment, that's pushed on to municipalities. So that's an important study committee to watch what comes out of that committee if that bill gets refined or reintroduced for the fiscal impact on municipalities. Next slide, please. So then there's some new laws that have been signed by the governor. Most of them, we weren't tracking these issues, but I figured I might as well do a little summary. For assessing, obviously, and tax exemptions, there was some sort of tidying up bills, as I would classify them as. One is clarifying the date of the asset evaluation for the disabled, deaf, and elderly, so that made some clarification statewide as to what snapshot in time you need to have those exemptions assessed. And then clarifies the formula for a person claiming tax exemption if they own a fractional interest in property. So there was just some tidying up with that language. This is another one to watch. Senate Bill 16 creates a stakeholders group to address utility poles. Anybody of you followed the legislature in the last, what is it, David, 10, 20 years? There's been so much fight about taxation and for utilities. So this stakeholders group is reporting out to the Senate. I would imagine they'll be reporting out on bills relative to taxation. So that's something that we should watch as that moves forward. Okay, next slide. And then there's some, the other one that's not on this list, which I apologize, it fell off, is a bill that changed the law for right to know on minutes from non-public session. That is House Bill 321. That is, the law is chapter 321, it's chapter 321 at any rate. So it requires public bodies to review meeting minutes, non-public meeting minutes, at least every 10 years to determine whether or not they still need to be withheld. So, and then there's this provision in the statute that says minutes that aren't reviewed after 10 years shall be made public. So what the legal team is doing is looking at that bill. You can kind of create a policy as to how you want to roll that out. So in 10 years, you've got to kind of look back and figure out, how that works. So I think that's going to come, there'll be a recommendation from legal as to how to address this new statute and what's the best process for council and future councils.
So if there were a concern raised about something that's more than 10 years old going public, the council would have to vote to keep it sealed.
Correct. So I think the policy will be, how do we roll out and review these old ones, right? Working with the city clerk and, does every council get a 10-year chunk or something, how does that work? So that'll become, but you're exactly right. So if you don't review it in 10 years' time, it becomes public. So there'll be a process by which, I don't know if something could be vetted in advance from the city clerk, or, there'll be a discussion, and we'll take a look at it and make some recommendation on that policy. And now here are just some miscellaneous bills. Political signs, removal of political signs. Some of you get calls about this, I'm sure, right? And they clarified that it's not just the candidate that has to remove the campaign signs. It can be someone from their committee or someone from the party can remove them. So that is interesting to those who get those calls. We have answers. Senate Bill 103 includes the raid on Fort William and Mary in Portsmouth in the planning of the American Revolution Sesquicentennial Commission. I learned a new word. Sesquicentennial means 250. So I didn't know that.
Right, that's coming up.
Had to look it up. So that passed as well. Senate Bill 110 is interesting because it clarifies residency for recipients of welfare. As you might imagine, there's folks that are in need oftentimes are in hospitals, and they go to hospitals in certain towns, and then when they get released from the hospital, how does that affect their residency? Sometimes there are space available in one town in a hotel, and if someone's from one town and goes to another, how do you figure out what the residency is for purposes of providing welfare benefits? And this bill clarifies how that's done. I checked with our director of welfare, and she said we were already doing it anyway. We have a great relationship calling neighboring towns and all of that, but this at least clarifies things statewide as to how you figure out who's responsible for paying for those recipients depending on their residency. And then there's some a bill relative to driveways. I think these are certain fire code regulations that apply to really long driveways, and there's specific widths and things like that. So this says really clarifies that a land use board has the authority to regulate driveways, notwithstanding there are certain other fire code regulations. I don't think that's going to apply to us too much, because I think the type of driveway that they're regulating is something we don't often see in Portsmouth. And then homeowners associations sometimes have obligations in subdivision plans. And this clarifies that if they're going to dissolve, who's left basically responsible for the things in a subdivision plan. So they must go before a land use board and have a public hearing before they dissolve, which is helpful. All right, so that takes care of the legislative wrap-up. Thank you. You're welcome.
And this slide speaks to agenda item number 4.
Yes.
Any questions first on the legislative wrap-up? Representative Muse, would anything to add to?
No, just that we are going to, our filing period in the House starts on Monday, the 11th of September, and closes on the 15th of September.
Wow, it's fast.
Yeah. So that's the House. There's a little bit more flexibility on the Senate side. I'm not sure when their filing deadlines are, but that's one of the reasons why I wanted to be here today. If there was something you wanted to make sure we paid attention to and got into the hopper by the middle of next month, that it got done. So.
Any other questions from the committee?
Did the governor sign the cannabis bill, the one that passed?
I thought he vetoed it. I think there was a veto in May. And I think it's it converted to the study committee, right?
That bill never made it out of the Senate.
Okay.
So there are, I think, 2 or 3 cannabis bills that are retained in my committee, criminal justice. Mm-hmm. I don't expect any of them will go anywhere. There'll be a fair amount of work that takes place. The real work is going to happen behind the scenes, because what the governor did in very, very rough framework when he vetoed, not vetoed, but when he commented after the Senate decided not to pass the bill. And what he said was he was looking for a bill that would make sure that we don't create these sort of cannabis retail strips like we see over in Kittery and down near the Massachusetts border. And he also is looking for some sort of a program where the sales would happen, in conjunction with the Liquor Commission. And I think still to be determined whether that's in existing stores. And an idea that was floated in a previous session was actually building stores next to or adjacent to the current liquor stores. So a bunch of things to be worked out.
Thank you. That's helpful to know. And then presumably there'll be a bill introduced that kind of follows some of those comments, you think? Or will the ones retained be amended, perhaps?
The ones that are retained may be amended, but I don't think any of them, unless they're, I'm not sure that the objective is to try to work any of the existing cannabis bills into the same framework that the governor had in mind. That's a possibility. And if that does happen, what would happen is those bills would be voted on in the Criminal Justice Committee probably sometime in November, and then like on January 3rd or 4th, the full House would vote for them, and if they pass the House, they go to the Senate, and from there. So it could happen that way, but it's just I'm pretty skeptical it will happen that way.
I guess, why are you, is there opposition to having more of a consolidated state-run approach in the House?
I think the issue with the bills now is the bills were all fairly different, and I'm trying to remember the retained bills, but some of them were just, one that I remember was a straight legalization bill. So essentially what we'd be doing is just decriminalizing cannabis. But there was nothing in the bill about education, about law enforcement, about how it would be sold, whether it would be sold. So what you have left are bills that have pieces, and in some cases they're important pieces. But what you don't have is something that actually puts it all together.
Right.
And that's what I think is probably most likely to happen behind the scenes. And whether that gets through or not, it's very tough because there's very much an ideological split that doesn't necessarily follow Democrat-Republican lines. There are some legislators who feel very strongly that cannabis should be controlled by the Liquor Commission, and there are other ones that feel equally strongly that we should follow the model that Maine, Massachusetts, and every other state in the country uses, where we basically license that out to private businesses, and we find a way to collect tax revenue from it.
How many other states follow our model when it comes to a liquor commission and state-sponsored liquor stores?
We would be the only state to sell cannabis through a state store.
Sorry, my question was how many other states follow our model for liquor?
For liquor, I don't know.
Pennsylvania, Maryland, there's a couple, not many.
Yeah.
Like Pennsylvania, I
A
think.
little different. They're all just a little different.
And then there's still limitations on the federal level, so the state selling marijuana or cannabis would... It's
still classified as a Class 1 narcotic. There are all kinds of issues for, like, for the private companies and entrepreneurs in places like Maine and Massachusetts, with how, being able to do things like, take debit cards and move cash around electronically and things like that I know they're trying to address in Congress. And they're kind of stalled there too.
Yeah.
17 is the answer.
17?
Yes.
Wow.
And Oregon actually is one of the only ones that has a Oregon Liquor and Cannabis Commission.
That's a joint cannabis and liquor
Liquor
commission.
commission.
Oh, interesting.
It's interesting.
What are they
My older
selling it?
sister's moving.
And with state-appointed agents who act as independent contractors.
Okay. So Oregon isn't actually, the state isn't actually selling cannabis.
No, they have state-appointed independent contractors.
Interesting. I would encourage anyone who is looking at this to go to Portland, Maine, and take a look at downtown Portland now, since this is passed, because in one block there are 4 cannabis stores. What's happened is they've come in and kind of taken over a lot of the shops in downtown. It's very interesting. So, so it would be lessons learned. It'd be nice to have some lessons learned before they take any clear action.
I think you run the risk, and this is just a commentary on kind of this, is you run the risk if you're regulating this, then are we not going to regulate alcohol? Are we not going to say, hey, you can't have, so that's where I worry about, I understand the concern of, rows and rows, but if you walk anywhere in Portsmouth, there's every other shop front is a place that sells alcohol. Very common in Manchester, Nashua, North Conway, Rochester, Milton.
Plus food.
Plus food.
Plus food.
Plus food.
Plus
Just
food.
make them
That's an
require
important-
food, Seems
Yep.
like it works out.
That's
Yeah.
right. Like,
Oreos.
that's the question is like,
Yeah.
what does it look like?
I just hope that we don't end up being so far behind on what we're seeing as a national trend.
Yeah.
A lot of education money.
A lot of education money.
Money.
I'm sure we'll get all of that.
Which
Yeah,
is a
Jane,
great
let's go to-
segue
Speaking
to
of
what's
education
happening,
fund.
because we may need the money. Both the Conville case that's been up to the Supreme Court and back is a case that is going to be decided probably in September. The case has been submitted, and it is a case that challenges the adequacy statute in two ways, basically. One is the definition. What are the components of an adequate education? And the other is the money assigned and defined by statute as to what it costs. So the petitioners have argued that there's loads of things that aren't in the adequacy statute that are part of an adequate education. Things like nurses, transportation, school facilities, custodians. And they also argue that there are a bunch of administrative rules and regulations that govern schools that have baked in them basically costs associated with these types of regulations. So the petitioner's argument is basically all that stuff really is the adequate cost of an adequate education, which the state is constitutionally obligated to provide. The state argument is a narrow one, and it's basically statutory construction and separation of powers. And what I mean by that is the adequacy statute that was actually challenged in the lawsuit is specifically defined. And so the state's like, we understand what you're saying, but what you've actually challenged is this small piece. And this small piece only says X. And we, as a state, can't read into statutes or add on to statutes stuff that's not there. That's the job of the legislature. And that's that separation of powers kind of argument. I can say, segueing into the next slide, for the State v. Rand, or excuse me, Rand v. State, that is the case that is also about education funding. That is the case that the City of Portsmouth, as a member of the Coalition Communities 2.0, intervened in, because that is the case that is challenging the retention of the excess swept. I attended the hearings on the cross motions for summary judgment last month, and the same judge is hearing both of these cases, which is good because it's highly specialized information. And what was interesting is he just issued an order on this Rand case saying nothing else in this Rand case will be addressed other than this narrow issue of the excess swept and the negative swept rate until I issue my order on the Conville case. Because, as he asked all the lawyers in the room, well, doesn't this excess swept issue go away if I simply raise adequacy to a higher amount? Because then everyone's going to be having to raise more per child, and these excess communities won't exist because they too will have to raise more. It will cost more per child. And every lawyer in the room said, you're right. So his order was just 2 weeks ago to say, I think he's going to do Conville first. I'm just surmising. And that's going to be the big the big case. And then he'll deal with this, the constitutionality of whether we can retain the excess SWEP, the old donor town argument. If obviously the judge makes the determination that it's unconstitutional to retain the excess SWEP, then that will be a fiscal impact to the city. You'd have to raise in local education tax what you used to retain for the excess SWEP, because we poured those right back into our school budget. But everything will be appealed. So no matter how the judge decides on either of these cases, they will very likely be appealed to the Supreme Court. And I can't tell you what issues would be appealed, but I'm surmising that no matter how the judge comes out on all of these issues, either the state's going to appeal or the plaintiffs are going to appeal if they're unhappy with the ruling. So it's too soon to tell, but we'll know a lot more in September when we get these orders. And the state's argument for the excess SWEP is, once again, kind of a narrow look at the statute and actually the Constitution in this instance, the actual provision of the Constitution that was cited by the petitioners. The state's claiming they don't have standing to raise these challenges under the particular provision of the Constitution that they cited. And they're also saying petitioners are mad about decisions that the Department of Revenue Administration has made, not the actual tax itself, because the actual tax is uniform and proportional and consistent with statutory requirements. What they're mad about is what DRA has said, which means, hey, you guys can keep your excess SWEP, which isn't in a statute or the Constitution section that they referenced. And DRA has decided that for those towns that don't have kids, they can set a negative SWEP rate so that they're not actually creating, they're not actually creating that SWEP, passing that SWEP along to residents if there are no children in that particular district. So we'll wait and see what's going to happen with those interesting cases, but they will be digested and they will likely be appealed. But the question will be, from the decision, whether the legislature takes action in the fall, because this is going to come out in September. So whether any bills come mirroring these decisions, notwithstanding appeals.
And I think in the past, the courts have sort of thrown this back to the legislature.
Consistently.
And the legislature has sort of thrown up a dead fish, and that's kind of been the pattern for years on this. There are ways to get legislation through. Emergency legislation goes to the Rules Committee, and if the Rules Committee approves it, it can kind of go on down through the cycle. So there are ways to make legislation happen at any point in the process. One thing that may play into it, too, is we may actually have a dead heat in the House by the time any legislation on this comes up. And my experience, to date has been, while we've been pretty far apart on some things, on things like this where we actually do have to work together and where we have, people from both parties who are basically into actually trying to solve the problem, there's more potential, to move something forward, even if it's outside of our usual, submission cycle. Something like this, I don't think we could sit on. We'd have to figure out something.
That's what I was curious about, because once the decision comes down, even if it gets appealed, it's definitely a messaging, certainly from the courts, and so it will be interesting to see how the legislature reacts to both decisions, notwithstanding appeals.
So the first decision will be the Convale?
Yes.
On whether or not
I think-
education is adequate.
I think he'll probably issue the narrow issue of the excess SWEP and the negative tax rate in the Rand case at the same time that he does the Convale, which is the whole adequacy issue.
The petitioners claim the retention of they or the state argues against the petitioners that are on the receiver town side of things, that the SWEPT is constitutional as is uniform as rate in rate. Is that a generally accepted? Do we generally accept that because they the application of a 5% or what have you percent is uniform in rate, even though it's grossly ununiform in action is a uniform tax rate?
That's exactly what you've hit on is how does the local education tax rate attach to the SWEPT? So what they're saying, and I don't have the right term, but they're saying it's de facto unequal because you have to look at them both together. That's what the petitioners are saying. They're saying it's not just the SWEPT that you look at, that the rate that's uniform, basically. It's all the disparate local education taxes that all these different towns need to raise that vary greatly. And that's the unconstitutionality. So you have identified the part of the petitioner's argument in the Conbell case.
But they take it as they take that the actual SWEPT.
Is not uniform because there is.
But it is constitutional in their mind, the SWEPT.
No.
They
Nope.
don't believe SWEPT is uniform, or is constitutional.
Because
requires
of the
proportionate.
Right, because they claim it's not proportionate. They're not challenging the fact that the state can make that tax. They're not challenging that type of tax is unconstitutional. You're right. They're challenging this not proportional.
So are
from
they?
town to town.
So they are on our side when we would pay much more in tax based on the SWEPT affecting our property values at a uniform rate and a much higher level. They
The
would agree
state
with
is
us?
on our side.
Okay.
The AG's office is arguing, as well as our intervener, that it is constitutional against the petition.
But like, I guess like, as long, like, I don't think it's constitutional because I think the returning of it is fine, but I wouldn't think that the ability for the state to raise a SWEPT based on its completely lack of uniformity across the communities. It affects us negatively because our property values are higher regardless of the ability to pay, but it's not proportional to the amount that people actually pay on a city-by-city basis. We pay much more in SWEPT and we retain it, so we're okay with it now. But if it were ever to go and we couldn't retain it, it
Higher.
would not be proportional to on a per-person basis in Portsmouth versus in Franklin. Does that?
I think you are conflating the how it's assessed with the actual tax rate, because it's the equalized property value that the property values differ.
Correct, yeah.
So I think that's what you're targeting, if I'm correct.
Yeah, so my original question is it proportional if it's not applied proportionally? Like, is it like on a per-person basis, because property is taken, is paid by people, not by houses in most cases, or from a commercial value of the house, that each individual, a Portsmouth resident, will pay proportionally more than a resident in a with less property value ascribed to their town through an equalized value?
They would look at I think the rate, not the per person payment.
Okay, so I guess my original question is like, is everybody in agreement that proportionality only, it's not on individual ability to pay, it's only on?
No, it's not on ability to pay at all. It's not on ability to pay at all.
Property poor.
If that's your question.
Okay.
Yes.
So the question, so like, we don't challenge that, they don't challenge that.
No one has raised the ability to pay in any of these lawsuits.
Okay.
But the effort is to balance. The property poor towns have to have very high school tax rates.
They have very high local.
Property rich towns have to have very low.
Have lower, exactly.
And so to get equal state funding, you either have to raise the adequacy number, which would make the state obligated to pay the difference for the property poor towns,
Correct.
or,
And where do they find that money?
yeah, or you withhold the excess and we create donor towns again.
But just so we are all very, very clear, the excess is less than $30 million. That's not a drop in the bucket of the amount of money that the state would need to pay for education throughout the state.
Yeah.
It's.
We don't have any ability to raise that money on the, or like without another income stream for the state of New Hampshire.
Right.
Without like,
That would, well,
Right.
I would think it would be very challenging.
what is the annual budget of the education department? Isn't like a 1.5 billion or something like
It's
that?
a lot, yeah.
You know,
Actually,
we spend a lot of
those
money
are-
on education in the state of New Hampshire. We're not that far behind Massachusetts. Like, we spend a lot of money. It's just all spent on the local level to do it, and it's unequal for, you know, towns like Franklin that don't want to pay, you know, teachers and can't hire teachers.
Yeah.
Right.
Teachers.
So the education budget for the state was $3.47 billion.
Oh,
It was
3.47.
23% of the state's budget. So there's other sources other than
Wait,
SWIFT,
hold
other
on.
than,
It's 23% of the state's budget?
yes.
How is
Yep.
that possible? They don't pay for, what is that going towards?
There are other statutes and other things other than SWEP for education funding. There's special education, there's building aid, there's all sorts of other,
How much does the state of New Hampshire spend on education on the local and state level?
I don't have that answer off the top of my head.
Yeah.
I don't either.
It'd be interesting to know how much money has also gone to vouchers,
That's gone what?
to the
To the-
voucher program.
Voucher program. I don't, last I checked, it hadn't had a huge impact, the whole freedom accounts and vouchers. But I can, at least in Portsmouth, when I checked with our school administrator.
Not here. I'm curious about this statewide. I think the number's a lot larger. That's a great way to get some money back to fund something.
Yeah, and it keeps outrunning whatever they appropriate for it.
Right.
Yeah.
Do they ever do an assessment of what the cost of education is in different parts of the state? Because the cost of a teacher on the seacoast is a lot higher than the cost of a teacher in Berlin.
The Education Commission 4 years ago did extensive report out on education funding and addressed those very issues, like the fact that we get we have the money to maybe pay a teacher that has more qualifications, whereas perhaps those towns that are less less affluent have great turnover because they're hiring new teachers and they're kind of cutting their teeth. There's extensive data, that hundreds of pages of data that the commission put forward on education funding that addressed some of those components and recommended a whole different way to look at education and education funding than adequacy in the statutory scheme that we have now. It was completely, they recommended a new way to look at it, input versus output basis. But the thing that they didn't do is they didn't do the finance piece associated with it. So they did great data on how to maybe fix the problem, but no work on how do we fund it. And I think, and that does have statistics on how much New Hampshire pays on average per pupil. I think it's like 16 grand per kid. But
We're
then
right there.
what's the state's portion of that? It's very low. It's mostly the local.
So Portsmouth, at least through the Chris Dwyer's presentation,
Right.
was we are at the average.
Yep.
And then, so.
Some spend a lot more, some spend a lot
I
less.
guess like the concern that I have, it seems like we've been, the interest groups that are pushing for a return to SWEPT and donor towns miss I think the larger issue that we might, Portsmouth is certainly has more property rich, and yet we will have many people that continue to own their homes and have owned their homes for a long period of time that will be forced to sell their homes if we have a 5% across the board increase to their taxes. And the conversation so far, seemingly, from some of the lobbying groups has been that this is an unjust system. And while it might be unjust, and it probably is unjust, the way that they're looking to solve this inequity is not any more fair in any way. And so concerned with especially in light of the fact that the SWEPT is but a drop in the bucket of like what they're looking to serve. It seems to sow more dissension among New Hampshire communities than it actually looks to create some sort of plan to address the inequity. Because, if we force Ma and Pa Kettle out of their homes by raising a SWEPT here, it's going to be painful, obviously, for this, but it's not going to solve the issues of Claremont
Yeah.
to do so.
And the constitutional issue is interesting because, everything is based on the one line that says, the state shall cherish education. And
The whole reason why an education is deemed a constitutional right. Yeah, that was one of the Claremonts and one of the
Right.
many.
But the state is saying, we can only act on what the legislature tells us to do. So there may be this vague obligation in the Constitution, but until the legislature,
Creates. Yep, and
instructs
defines and
us.
instructs. Yep.
Yeah, there's no way to go forward. So that's a stalemate.
I forget which case, whether it's Conval or State Remand. I think it is Conval that says, Your Honor, we've been coming to the judiciary for 20, 30 years on this issue. It's time for you to take action, and in certain instances, judicial action is necessary, and not wait for the legislature to make, its changes, because they're arguing it's failed. It has failed to do so over many decades. So we'll see. I mean, that certainly would be appealed if the judge were to say, "I'm setting the rate at such and such." So we'll see how that goes.
There have been attempts to kind of to clarify adequacy and redefine it, and unfortunately those turn into political footballs depending on which side you're on, and the bottom line is nobody has really had the votes to push anything like that through, and I think with the court cases going on in the background, there's been some reluctance to do that too. So I think a lot of people right now are just sort of, in a wait and see mode to see what the court does. I know that folks on the Education Committee, Mel Myler, Dave Luno, a couple of representatives who are sort of deeply involved in this, I think that they're, looking at this really carefully. And I know Rick Ladd, who's the chairman of the Education Committee, is looking at it pretty carefully too. But I don't think we have the option to not do anything if the court comes down with a decision that tells us we have to do something. And hopefully if the court does that, they're smart enough to say, and if you don't do something, here's what has to happen.
That would be the.
Maybe I
that's been the
mischaracterized it. The legislature has done something. The formula's changed a bunch of times over the course. I don't mean to imply that the legislature hasn't acted, but I think the petitioner's argument is hasn't done enough or addressed the full scope of the issue, because there's certainly been attempts and changes to the formula and over the many years. But
Well, in the original early days of the statewide property tax, there were donor towns. There were towns whose surplus was given to property poor towns. And then the legislature just said, well, we're going to make the adequacy number so low that we won't have to do that.
And the problem in New Hampshire is the quality of a kid's education can be very much dependent on the zip code they live in, and that kind of flies in the face of every child deserves an adequate education. So, and we get kind of wrapped around the axle with trying to define what that means. But I think one of the ways I think we're finally going to get around it is my observation is we fund education in a way that's different from almost any other state. Mm-hmm. And the mission we sort of give ourselves is, let's build a car that will drive us to Boston, only let's build a car that doesn't have any wheels. And I mean, that's kind of the equivalent of what we try to do with the taxation system that we have now. And I think just because of the way that this particular state is wired, it's just a very, very difficult thing to change that system. And, so what you get instead is you get the illusion of motion, the illusion of action. You get something, but what you don't get is problem solved. You still have kids in one zip code who are getting a way better education than kids in other zip codes, and that just stays with us.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. The biggest challenge is that most states, when they fund education, they're funding it through an income tax. So it's much easier than to determine what the rate is across the state for an adequate education and provide every district that money per pupil, because it's a statewide levied tax on individuals. It'd be very hard to do that in New Hampshire unless you were assessing cities and towns based upon their population. You have X number of persons, so therefore you pay X amount rather than based upon property, because the property values, it's very, very hard, clearly, to find an equalization.
It's a very hard system to base the education funding on.
Very difficult to change
Very, very hard.
the tax structure. I mean, a couple of sessions ago, there was a bill that would have added a capital gains tax to the interest and dividends tax that very, very few people would have actually earned enough to pay into. Virtually all the money for that would have gone into education, and it would have helped a lot, but we just didn't have the votes to put it through. And the other thing is even if you have the votes to get it through the House and the Senate, you still have to have a governor who's willing to sign it. And that's been an issue with any kind of broad-based tax, for not just for with Republican governors, but with Democratic governors too.
I think the current climate will have more issues with any increase in adequacy or state funding of that, just given the direction, especially since COVID and the conversations with freedom accounts and general distrust of education professionals when it comes to schooling. And onto the point of the zip codes, that is completely true, not 100% related, at least in my opinion, to the quality of an education, because education is so much more than what you get in school. It is the amount of time your parents can spend creating extracurricular opportunities and have you. So it's not surprising that aligns to zip codes, and that's also going to be going through that. But I guess, thank you for the update, Jane, on that. I think there's a, Representative Muse, if you figure out a way to solve this, please let us know.
Oh, man.
And, I am hopeful in that I think that most people that are lucky enough to serve in the House of Representatives or serve here, in the City Council or in the Senate or as governor, do credit the position that they're in some way, big or small, to the education they received. And we know that educated workforce is a strong workforce. There's a lot of reasons why we want a positive and strong education system, and that we'd hope that if there was a way to define education through a bipartisan effort, that's something that we would certainly support in a positive way to raise the adequacy level of that. That would be, I think, a win for the state. But that's why you get paid the big bucks, Representative Muse, to try to figure that one out. That's a. Well, we'll see in September. Exciting times.
That's it.
Will they have it at September 14th or 15th?
I don't know.
We'll be we'll be right before the filing deadline?
Oh, my gosh.
All right. So thank you, Senior Assistant City Attorney. Next up is the NHMA Legislative Policy Process Committee to discuss NHMA's legislative policy process.
So their policies last from 2023 to 2024. I think our first meeting of this committee, I sent the NHMA policies. We also have our city policies, which segues into the committees to discuss legislative issues of interest, which Representative Muse also discussed. So we have these policies, we have, various issues the city is interested in. If we do have any that match up with our policies, we should reach out to our representatives because the filing deadline for the House is fastly approaching, and obviously work with Senator Perkins Coca. So if the committee wants to have another meeting or provide some guidance, I'd be happy to reach out and ask if there are certain issues that we want to address.
One would be, New Hampshire is so far behind our other peer states in the percent of renewables that we require in our electricity and in the amount of solar that we allow people to put back into the grid. We have pretty low caps on that, in contrast to Maine and Massachusetts. So we're really hampering solar and wind and hydro. And I don't know, David, if you're seeing anything, motion on any of that.
It's been, there's been motion, but it's been backwards.
Yeah,
Yeah, so
yeah. Yeah.
that doesn't count.
And then the question is realistically, given the climate, what issues are we, as a committee, are we interested in bringing forward and testifying? Because, if do we want to bring up the hotel occupancy again, or do we kind of feel like that's
So
not?
what do we think about the makeup of the House with that this time?
Regardless to,
The hotel occupancy. Do we need a supermajority of the Democrats to make it happen? Are there any Republicans that are feeling the pinch?
I think one of the things that needs to happen for that to happen is it needs to be paired with something else. So it's one of those issues that doesn't necessarily boil down to Democrat. There's a lot of it that boils down to Dems versus Republicans, but there's a part of it that also just boils down to, cities with more tourist business, like Portsmouth, Manchester, Nashua, bigger cities, bigger places with more tourists, convention centers, are collecting all of this revenue, and there's an argument, they should be allowed more to keep it, but then the same cities and towns that we're talking about that have to raise their property tax rates to crazy levels to pay for their schools would be getting less money coming in if Portsmouth and cities, if cities like Portsmouth took more money out of it. So I mean, to me, and I know the linkage is it's a little bit convoluted and hard to see, but from the perspective of getting something passed, sometimes it boils down to an issue of, big town versus small town.
Sure. I don't know if
Or
we're quite the
small
big, we're not, I don't know if we qualify as a big city. I've been saying recently there's a reason why there's a boat on the state flag. I think we're the best place to live in New Hampshire. But I guess if it's looked at, we're going to lose the argument all day if it's looked at, Portsmouth wants to keep more of what Portsmouth gets because we don't, believe that we should share anything with the state. We share, upwards of $30 million with the state and get $1.8 million back. And the result of that is taxpayers in Portsmouth having an undue burden, even though this is benefiting the state, and we recognize that. But focusing on and we see it in Portsmouth now, and, Representative, you see it, I'm sure, when it comes to the push against any sort of development or any hotel or any feeling of like, what has this gotten us in Portsmouth? It's gotten me higher taxes. It's gotten me, more police, more fire, bigger ladder trucks, bigger capital improvements to deal with the 5-story hotels. And none of that comes back to lowering my taxes, even though, it's slowed the creep up of, taxes because we have a higher commercial rate. So, you know, if not you know, another way to do it would be from a compelling argument of, okay, what would we require from businesses that are delivering these services? Can we compel them to have better books and records that they have to submit to the cities and municipalities when it comes to valuing their commercial properties? Because right now, there's no requirement to do that. Right now, Roseanne looks at the apartments from a commercial tax base of what they're, you know, charging and works backwards, but there's no reporting standpoint for that. And the abatements, you know, there's a different rule book for people with higher powered attorneys that are going to come and ask for a tax abatement on a commercial property versus, you know, the neighbors that we live next to that just don't have doesn't make maybe financial sense for them to hire an attorney to do so because they're not going to get, you know, $3 million off their valuation. So, like, there's a lot there that it doesn't necessarily, I guess, like, instead of looking at it from a standpoint of we need this fee, like, we need more equity in terms of, like, the benefit that these businesses are bringing to the state and the cost that it's costing individual communities that have to
That's a good way to
support
frame
that.
it. That's a good way to frame it. Because I think a lot of times in the legislature, it just gets framed as, you know, a rich city wants a bigger slice of the pie. And
Sure.
I think that's a very easy way to communicate it.
And on average, we are
That's
now.
what we're up against.
On average, we're now a richer city, but the average is, it's just a blend of, you know, the very fortunate that have moved into a town that was, at least when I was born, you know, a Navy town that, you know, there's still people living here that are not those super rich that are looking at on a daily basis of whether or not they take the equity of their house and leave to places unknown. And so on average, we're wealthier, but that's only because we've had more rich people move in. Like, there's still a lot of people that can't afford the taxes and are pressed against.
But the ability to require the income of a commercial building so that you can do an income-based appraisal as opposed to just a market appraisal, that, Roseanne will tell you, that could make a big difference.
Right. Or if we could just levy a tax in addition to the state tax. So if we could levy the additional, you know, percentage on top of the state tax to rooms and meals as a city rooms and meals tax, if we had that enabling legislation, that would be great. So I would love to be able to levy an additional, you know, 0.5%. I mean, it doesn't have to be that, but 0.5% would
I think,
be a lot of money coming into the city of
Jane, you
Portsmouth.
would probably say the state is jealous of its taxing power.
It is.
Want to give it away to anyone.
No, but, you know,
Right.
but then that's a local decision because you're impacting your businesses in town. So you would be wise about it.
Yep, and I would think just, you know, like, there's a lot of things that we do in the, you know, I think if we were to go down the path of an additional fee or additional tax or additional percentage, you know, all of those things would require a strong support of the Chamber of Commerce's, and with that would come a requirement to put those efforts into things that we would already be doing anyways, that we do as a matter of, you know, delivering from, you know, either parking-related activities or things like that, like from a beautification standpoint for the downtown, that improve tourism, have a general, like, it's easier for us to spend money as a city of Portsmouth on beautification infrastructure projects that draw more people to the city and thus the state, if that was a separate and different revenue stream from a tax base that doesn't seem to want a lot of people focused on the downtown when there's a lot of things that we could focus on. So if there's a separate, you know, it would free up our general fund to focus on some of the needs and maybe not the wants of the business and tourism community, and be able to, but that would be a heavy, you know, requirement. And, you know, we had it, 4 years ago with Lister, or 6 years ago, when it was like a, you know, it was pushing the chambers of commerce that were also, you know, on board with that in Hampton. But since then, you know, that's fallen off. It seems like we don't have the, you know, we might have that. And I know, Ben Van Camp was talking about some volunteer type things they do in the Upper Valley, and that sort of, you know, went by the wayside, as I would expect. And So having the chamber, if it's an additional, like, and having carve-outs for that, so it can be positioned as this is how we would grow the tourism pie for, you know, the entire state. It benefits, you know, other communities when more people come up to Portsmouth. You know, we're great, we got all the things you could possibly need except, you know, maple syrup, you know. So there's other places to go for that. You know, there's a lot of, you know, we're a gateway to a lot of tourism, and it would benefit the state if we did that, but we'd have to have the chambers on board with something like that, you know. I think it'd be tough to require. I think the pushback is that the state isn't they don't have the system to actually carve out where, like, you know, like if you're a Dunks, like, you know, like you're sending in, you know, you're sending revenue or something to the state, but how do you carve that out from like a per, you know, city standpoint? That's what I've heard in the past, that they don't have the ability to do that. I find that somewhat ridiculous, but, you know, knowing the Secretary of State's website, it's, you know, there's it's a lot of work in progress there on the IT side, so, but that would be another way that we could get the same out, and that's just equity around, you know, like, you know, we know, like, all of the commercial, you know, like my house, it does one commercial thing, it gets sold, or it doesn't get sold. And I have to declare that, you know, that actual, when it turns into a commercial enterprise for me, I have to report that to the state, get a tax stamp, all of that. But businesses don't have to do that on a yearly basis when they're getting, you know, revenues based on this commercial property. So that might be another way that we could skin that cat.
I've always wondered too, I mean, your opposite party on the other side of the aisle always likes improvement districts. You know, is there a pathway to downtown improvement districts where localities could say, we're going to make this attractive for tourism, but we're going to have a, you know, a tax increment to do that in this downtown district? I don't know if there's any legislative path to that.
I'm not sure. That's one I would talk to Senator Perkins Clocker about. I can take notes in this area, but this is.
And there's
my
existing
area of
legislation about
expertise.
TIF districts and things like that.
Right.
You know, there's existing stuff that's worth a look. You know, what could we do within the existing law?
They
Well,
exist.
that's the thing that I think that we're always up against is we have to create a balanced budget every time. There is only so much money. Sometimes the federal government comes in and rescues you. Other times it doesn't, and the rescues don't necessarily need to be fair or regular. They can happen whenever they happen.
So one thing just on that reminded me of a question that I had earlier. Is it possible to have an easier reporting when it comes to how much the state is spending? Because we have HB1, which talks about how much all the programs that you're entitled, and HB2 has all the money that you raise to pay for that, but it doesn't also include the money that you're receiving from federal offsets, as I understand.
The best breakdown that I've seen is, and I'd have to look on their website, you have to kind of poke around and find stuff, but New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute has a really good breakdown of like all the areas that the state spends money on, and then it has another really good breakdown on all the different revenue sources. And I'm always sending it off to new legislators who.
It would be really great, because in the city of Portsmouth, we got to say, this is our budget.
Yeah.
This is the budget that we spend money on, and it goes up or it goes down, goes up. And that's what we spend money on. It'd be really great if there could be a clear and concise, transparent, so folks can understand at home. Not that we only are raising this much, so taxes are only going up X amount, but like, this is the actual, like, because I think it would be helpful for, one, people to know how much money we get from the federal government, from especially in the last couple of years, like in terms of, quote, balancing the budget. It would be helpful from a transparency standpoint to see like what the state budget is on a year in and year out basis, and how we can track to see, just to see that would be helpful, because it's a balanced budget, sure, but it's But understanding like the budget, goes up would be helpful from a municipal standpoint to make arguments.
The way it's shown sometimes too, like there's a big section for health and human services, and which includes things like the Medicaid contribution. And,
Sure.
So enormous, basically it's an enormous pile of cash that isn't really broken down into component parts so you can really sort of see what it looks like. But it does give you an idea, what the big areas are that we spend money on. And then on the revenue side, there are some myth busters, so a lot of people think that, we fund education through the lottery and through
40 years of
liquor
the lottery,
sales and things
yeah.
like that. And you find out, oh no, it's actually just this little tiny sliver.
What is it? It's like 50 years of the lottery. It's raised half of 1 year's budget. It's like it's like $1.8 billion of the course of the lottery is enough money to pay for 1/2 of 1 year's education budget in the state of New Hampshire.
See, sometimes I wonder if we should invest half of the school budget in lottery tickets.
All right. Well, I think so. September, the filing is open September 11th. I don't know if we will. I think our general consensus is the same. Some of the same bills as in the past to continue down that, and we do have Rebecca or Senator Perkins Quokka to help us from later. But are there bills that you're focused on, Representative, that we should be aware of that you're going to be introducing? You're a criminal justice guy, so a lot of them have been
most
focused
of. Just to give you kind of a quick idea, one issue I've been digging into is the placement of children in out-of-state schools and treatment facilities. So I've been working with the child advocate to figure out if should we basically pass a bill that says we can't do that anymore. Should we create a study committee to look further into the issue? But the thing is we've gotten to a point where it seems like the legislature needs to give DCYF a nudge, maybe more than just a nudge. And the situation we're in with the Sununu Center is Sununu Center is going to be shutting down. We've already got it down to about a dozen kids. And the whole issue with those kids in Tennessee has made me think, is that what we've been doing? We've been, instead of sending kids to the Sununu Center, we've been shipping them out of state. What's the process for doing this? And we're not even doing on-site certifications. So that's one thing. One of the things that I'm personally tied up a lot in is we're trying to rework the bills regarding bail, the bail system in New Hampshire. And hopefully we're going to get to some sort of a bipartisan approach that will kind of address some of the pain points that Manchester has been seeing while also being attentive to people's constitutional rights and the fact that we just can't throw people in prison just because they've committed a crime that we consider dangerous. The Supreme Court says we can't do that without clear and convincing evidence, and nothing in the bills that have been submitted so far, gets us there. What I'd say about, in general about other things, there are a lot of things that are sort of in process right now, but the problem with our whole filing system is a lot of times we don't know. Even Democrats don't necessarily know what Democrats are going to file, and we certainly don't know what people on the other side of the aisle and the independents are going to file until we start seeing things about 2 weeks after the filing deadline where the LSRs start to appear on the website. And by that time, if we look at it and we say, well, gee, nobody's filed a bill on this or nobody's filed a bill on that, what we have to do is pick up the phone and call a senator and say, hey, we missed the boat, we should have filed a bill here, can we work on this bill? And there was a bill like that I worked on, in the last session where we were past filing date. So it can be done, and that bill actually got signed by the governor. But there's, you know, there are ways to make things happen, but it just gets exponentially more difficult. The other thing that I would say too is the stuff that's going on now in Portsmouth, where we're actually showing the world that you can build workforce housing, you can have good, robust discussions about workforce housing and creating affordable housing. Those stories really resonate in other parts of the state. And one of the things that, to be aware of in terms of the bills you might expect to see, there will probably be a fair amount of additional bills that try to chew into local control when it comes to housing. And so the more we can show people that these committees and the way that we do things at the local level can work. We can get workforce housing built, we can get affordable housing built. The more stories like that there are to share, the less likely it is that somebody's going to come in and say, you guys can't do that anymore. We're taking away your ability to do that. We're taking away your power in this area, and we're going to give it to some state board. That's, as long as we have a housing crisis, I mean, in this state, that's a real risk for people at the local level. And I tell you, it's a lot easier to pass a law that takes power away from a municipality than it is to give powers to a municipality. So that just a note of caution.
So I think we're not always in Portsmouth the shining example, and there's many examples of when a zoning board or planning board might deny things, but that's because we're looking at a larger breadth of trying to get things done. I feel like we should be able to make these decisions, but that's because they live in a community where we do mostly make the right decision on that. I think some of those local control things would negatively impact, if they view it as negatively, some of our neighbors, much more so than us. And while I would like to, any changes to local control, I hope would be aligned with a understanding of, levels to get there, and not a broad blanket, California approach of, okay, 200 miles versus, or 220 miles of this, you kind of lose it if you don't have a plan. We do have a plan to increase housing density and housing stock. I think the efforts of educating boards, I think they know exactly what they're doing. I don't know if I'm going to spend a lot of time educating a zoning board about getting more housing and why it could be effective. I think they know what they're doing and when they're making their decisions, certainly in other communities, on preventing housing. But I would just hope that if there's broad reach from the state to try to do this, as there was with ADUs under Martha Fuller Clark, which turned out okay, that it would understand that the communities were not created equally in terms of how we've been looking to address this thus far. I don't think that the rules that would come would be a negative impact on us, but they should be should definitely look at some of the communities that say no housing allowed in this commercial zone type thing before we're going to start moving to things like every house immediately becomes a 4-person house, because that's just going to get more people pissed off about their neighborhoods, versus when the bigger fish are the folks that have made zoning so restrictive that you're not talking 4 units, you're not talking 1 unit. So focusing it on areas where you would have the biggest return with the least amount of pushback from the folks, and that's around, I think, residential units in commercial areas that have so far been blocked off from that because there's already the infrastructure that exists there.
Yeah. I'd also love to see something around absentee ownership from out-of-state owners. So corporate ownership buying up housing to rent these out-of-state entities.
maybe you get a homestead exemption in the education standpoint, too. You know, just like you live in your house, we get a homestead exemption, and then just raise the, it would be, have to, I don't know how that would be, aligned constitutionally, but the homestead exemption would be something that, would incentivize hopefully people to live in, the houses that they buy and not just turn them into Airbnbs.
Have we seen in Portsmouth, I know it's an issue in other states, but private equity firms coming in and buying single-family homes and rental properties and then jacking up the rates? And
Yep, we have
Yep.
some, I get calls on a pretty frequent basis of folks that have, if it's not a private equity, it's a property management company that comes and buys the property, moves everybody out. They're looking for places to live, and then they have, basically, they're told that they're going to make improvements, and those improvements are going to result in, doubling of the rent. That's probably a weekly call of somebody reaching out on that.
Then there's real estate investment trusts snooping around for housing that they can buy. and
But
investing in that.
I don't know if we're gonna, like, it's the one thing that we can do in Portsmouth to lower the cost of housing is to make it a crappy place to live.
I'm sorry, is make it what?
A crappy place to live.
You're right.
Like, we can, like, if we all of a sudden said, you know what, we're gonna blow up the sewage treatment plant, and we're just turning that hose right into Piscataqua, property values would drop.
Let's get rid of all that arts and culture.
Yeah, so it's, I guess, like, I appreciate the effort that's been very developer-focused of, like, let's make it easier to build. I think that it would be nice to see the legislature focus on things that are like, we're not in the New Hampshire housing market, regardless of what, folks might think in Concord. We are a Boston, even New York housing market. So, like, creating more opportunities to create affordable housing, like below market rate housing. I don't think that we're going to have a chance to correct the market without destroying everything that everybody likes about, the places that we live. We are just not, there's not enough houses that we could put that are going to lower, unless we somehow reduce the demand for our houses. And we are sitting on top of Massachusetts with a lot of people that they come up to New Hampshire, they go, oh, I can work remotely, I can get down to Boston, a couple times a month. This is great. Why would I live anywhere else? And so that's what we're contending with, and I appreciate the efforts that have been for developer focused there, but I think that there should be some sort of incentivization from a, if it's a room and meals, there should be more money that allows us to do some of those below market rate housing projects that we'd like to do here. And so far, the $100 million have been focused on just shovel-ready projects that have, that make it, just de-risk it for developers.
Yeah. The Minneapolis and some other cities are experimenting with allowing greater density. Single-family lots can be doubles, triples, and scrapping parking requirements.
Parking, that's the thing. It's the
biggie.
parking, and that's like an us thing. Like, we gotta get Andrew, and PTS to have a citywide parking program so that we can actually limit the parking that people can have assigned to their housing. Because nobody wants to, literally nobody wants to have a house built next to them and then 3 more cars out there. That's not what they signed up for when they bought their house. And to hope that people are going to be altruistic in their choices for their own individual life, it's, they're not sitting, they didn't run for council, they didn't, they're not running for a state legislature. They are focused, on their lives as they should be. And but the parking is the thing that kills people the most. So another aspect, and what we would, I guess, remind me, we spend a pittance on Coast, and we're talking about losing more funding for Coast. So if we want a regional focus on, housing, we got to make it easier to move around without parking a car. You can own a car, but everybody's going to own a car likely in New Hampshire because we live in New Hampshire. But reduce the amount of times that you have to go park that car to go to work would be fantastic, and it would be a big boom for for us here in Portsmouth, but it would be a great boon for, we notice it now, and that there's a lot of people that, the nightlife in the downtown, there's a lot of service workers that are not living downtown anymore because they've been priced out. So it's quiet down there at night, and they're taking that money back to, over the bridge. That's actually happening. But transportation would be another big thing that, coast funding is just, it got saved by some federal money, but that's a big thing that we need to make sure, because it's going to be a hit to our budget of $1 million over on an annual basis for 3 years, which is hard to imagine. But the seniors that are going to be left behind, if we don't do something like that, it's going to be pretty catastrophic. And it could be, it could be actually useful for people that are going to get, or that would benefit from that, not having to park the car. Not trying to get rid of cars. People love cars. They need cars in New Hampshire, do all the fun things that we do in New Hampshire. But they don't need them to go to work, or they shouldn't need them to go to work as much as they.
Oh, I think
they
if
do.
you could, if all the master plans, 2005
Yeah.
on, have said, we need better transportation. And it would, if you had a loop that went up into the West End and brought people down to work, and then they could take that home.
Yeah.
If we could be a city where a young person or a young couple didn't have to have a car, that's a very attractive
Oh,
position to be, but it's
Right.
really hard to get there.
I have neighbors like this.
Yeah.
Well, I have neighbors without parking, and so neighbor across the street, it's 2 adults, 1 infant, they have 1 car. They don't have 2 cars, they have 1 car.
We got a car now. We got a moped. It's pretty cool, that moped.
And there's always a bike.
Yeah.
Well, David, or Representative Mead, what's the best time to, if there are additional, additional things? I think there's Jane, would it be fair to say that we have a list of the frequent flyers of legislation that we've put forth before?
Sure, yeah.
And maybe we revise that and
Okay.
send it to you in the interim as a representative here, and share with the entire delegation here. But the goal is, especially on the, I'm not trying to charge into the breach again on the room and meals tax without felt like last time we brought it, it was not coordinated well from different municipalities and the different stakeholders that need to be a part of it. I'm happy to reach out to the Chamber of Commerce and say this would be something that I think is, important. We could align that to, maybe it's to, affordable housing, something along those lines, tax credits that we could give to people building affordable housing, all of these, to increase the, I guess, there needs to be more work before it kind of gets to your plate on that, because just introducing a bill without the people that are that feel as though they're a part of that bill means that they're not going to come testify on that bill.
Well, one of the things we can do is you have to file the bill. When you create a legislative service request, that just basically kicks OLS into action, Office of Legislative Services into action to just create, a bill. Then what they do is they send it back to you for amendments.
Okay.
And so what effectively happens is you get anywhere from about another 3 to 4 weeks after the filing period, where basically you can take out almost everything in the original bill and just substitute it with something
Okay.
else.
Why don't we do, then, maybe as an order of operations, the filing period ends the 14th. There is 2 weeks before they come back, and then we still have an additional 2 weeks to amend those bills.
Yes.
It might make sense to schedule a meeting in that delta between the time that you have to amend and when we see what has been filed by everyone. And we'll give you a list of things that we would hope to see, to have the opportunity to discuss again after the filing period and before it's definitively needs to kind of be put to.
That would be good.
Okay,
And
so-
I can, I've seen some of the preliminary ideas, and I think there was a legislator who was going to do something on the rooms and meals tax. What you try to do is, rather than picking up a bill that got killed, 1 or 2 terms, what you try to do is to look at the different bills over the years and say, is there a different way we can come at this, or is there kind of a combination of things, or what was the failure point on this bill? So what you don't want to do is just submit a bill that was submitted 2 years ago
Yeah.
and then face the same thing all over again. So that's kind of the challenge.
Save the trip to Concord on that. Oh, myself, just going, yep, thank you, Member Cochran, we'll see you later, you know.
Oh, I know.
So if there's I do think having the chamber very much involved, at least the time that it got some traction, the chamber was pushing for.
It makes a huge difference when it's not just the guy from the municipal association up there by himself.
Or the mayor of Portsmouth, or Portsmouth just in
Yeah.
general, because they think we paint, gold bullion red and put it in our
I mean,
sidewalks.
this is how stuff gets done. I mean, if you have basically a conga line of people that get up there, they make their points effectively. They give good examples. They're not people that that these committees see every day. That's what really kind of gets the attention of people. It's almost like people see an orange badge and they go to sleep.
Sure, yeah.
Right.
Well, on the rooms and meals, I think like they're looking at, they're looking at giving us so far we've focused our efforts on that and talking about we want a piece of this pie. And I think what would be effective with the chamber is like, how can we grow the pie for New Hampshire? What would it take for Portsmouth to be a part of growing that pie for the state of New Hampshire? And that would also include us getting a bigger piece of that pie because of all the pushback that we have from just a local level about the investment that we already make in our downtown. When we know we could make more investment there to spur more investment from outside folks that would then end up rooms and meals tax would go out to the state, but we would have more of that.
So growing the pie versus growing the rate, because we've actually reduced the rate.
That's right.
That's right.
Yeah. So
I'm changing the math a little bit, but that's okay. And then, so after September, after the filing period, we will have, or before the filing period, we will give you a list of things as more or less placeholders of things that we would like to come back on after the filing period. And in that meeting, we will have a more nuanced or a more tightly a tight agenda on those things that we would like your and the delegation's help with in Concord.
And if those things can be sketched out well enough, what OLS typically will do is you can basically say, I would like a bill that accomplishes these three things, kind of like this law in Minnesota or whatever, and you can send them the copy of that law. And then what they'll come back to you with is basically a draft that says, well, here's the statute we think that goes into, here are the other statutes that it needs to cross-reference to, here's a way to say that. And I would say 9 times out of 10, it's not what you wind up going with. You wind up making other changes, but what it can do is it can get you there. A lot of the legislation I write, because it's criminal justice, typically criminal justice related, I actually write the legislation as opposed to looking for OLS to write the legislation. But in something like this is an area where it may actually be helpful.
Sure.
To
And I think on the commercial valuation or valuation of properties, giving more authority, I think there's, especially because next, we will see it in Portsmouth, and I don't know if other towns have looked at it the same way. We will see commercial property likely dip next year, so it will be, it will be a good time if we're going to change the formula at all or add anything to the formula that would allow us to maintain that. It would be a positive thing. It would be a positive time, at least in Portsmouth, because we've delayed our revaluations until the mandatory 5-year reporting. So if we could have more information on that wasn't simply sale prices, and know that sale prices are limited, especially in this economic, environment we find ourselves in, would be a positive thing. And then it's less like we got to end up spending a ton of money with abatements, because sale prices are a shitty way to, or a bad way to do, to identify commercial property. And then it could also, like, it could be helpful. There could be an argument to say, hey, like, if this is what they're choosing, it could incentivize, you could put a local business spin on this, and like, this is not a bank, like, we shouldn't be looking at this building as a potential bank and rating against that, because our downtowns are more vibrant when we don't just have, just banks there. If this is a person that's using this, this property for, cafe, which we all, know and love, they shouldn't be necessarily penalized for that. We can look at that. I think there's something there from Tabor's.
Well, one thing I like about what you're talking about is to get a bill through, there are ways that you have to message it. And sometimes, like, one of the worst situations to be in is to have a bill you really want to pass, and you look at the language of the bill, and it's really hard to make it, to get your message to align with the way the bill that it's written. And sometimes, if you create a bill, I mean, essentially, if there's a message you want to send, an outcome you want to achieve, and you design a bill that achieves that outcome in a way that lets you message it effectively, you can kind of bake that into the bill itself, and it just makes it. And I mean, a really simple example of how you do that are the bills that we see periodically around victims' rights and things like that, where it's Angie's bill, it's Philip's bill, and it's related directly to a particular case, and it makes it easier for people to get their arms around it, and also makes it harder for people to oppose it, even if they have good reasons to oppose
Sure.
it.
Yep. Oh, and victim advocates bills have been effective at that. I don't think there's been a time when I've gone to Concord and haven't beaten on the drum of local control, because it seems like that aligns to some of the municipal folks that serve on maybe the other side of the aisle from myself there. But the local control and commercial valuation, bill would be, I think there's to be able to choose to be able to enact that on a local level. But we could figure out a mom and pop shop that we could,
Well,
demonstrate.
you could call if you got the ability to require income for appraisals, you could call that the Hilton Garden Bill, because the Hilton Garden Inn was on the books for the city at $23 million. It sold for $40 million.
Oh.
The reason it sold for 40 is because it has an income stream
Yeah.
that justifies borrowing that much money
Wow.
and having that much equity in the.
But we
building.
can't use that because they don't have to give that to us. And so and they have a bunch of lawyers that are coming in looking for abatements on all this, on all these things, and they beat us up over that. And it's, and at the same time, we don't want to, we don't, like, and Roseanne will say this, she doesn't want to go and value every building as if it's like, a Hilton Garden Inn or, a bank prov, because that will kill the local, businesses that, like, if they showed, like, hey, this is what you're making, this is the rent, that would be a better way to incentivize, like those local, stores, and give them a chance, to say, hey, we don't want to drive out our local retailers in the downtown Portsmouth, because we know that, we will get more tax revenue until we will get no tax revenue, or very significantly when we turn into a completely, corporatized downtown. So, like, having the ability to see those revenue dollars would be, and they, some of the local retailers will share that, voluntarily, but it's not, it's some of the ones that are making a ton more money will not, and that's, I think, where they're. I'd be interested to talk to, we should probably talk to Roseanne about this to see what are, like, the downsides and maybe the constitutionality of this. But if we could have a requirement for just how much money, they are, those income or those properties are producing, that would be a huge help for our ability to, one, weather the storm with the commercial properties dropping, because commercial sale prices have dropped, and two, continue to shift towards we could get the same out of the room and meals tax without actually getting a room and meals tax if we just got it out of the valuations. Because that's something we've been asked up there, is like, well, aren't you getting this revenue, like, already? It's like, no, we don't actually know how much we're getting from that.
Yeah, that's true.
And market prices for commercial buildings will fall in this, and there'll be a smaller percentage of the tax base. What commercial used to be, 46%, I think, at its height. It's probably going to fall down into the low 40s, which means that burden shifts onto the local property taxpayer.
I don't think we have seen, and in terms of just commercial real estate, there are places my old company was based out in Lincolnshire, Illinois, in the suburbs, and that whole area now, places like Lake Forest, Deerfield, where the housing market was just going crazy before COVID, has just completely fallen back down to earth. Like the company that I work for used to employ 20,000 people in Lincolnshire alone. Now they employ 0. They're they've moved to Chicago. A lot of their people who used to come to work in offices every day are now working out of their homes. They're going to have a shared office space set up in Chicago. It's like the nature of work COVID has fundamentally changed the nature of a lot of work.
We all drive by the
And
Maplewood Avenue project, that brand-new building with Heinemann, and the first floor is empty. And
Yep, so the
See right
commercial,
through it.
you know, so I think there could be, you know, like we hear it a lot from folks in terms of taxes, commercial, you know, building and property owners. And Roseanne tries to do this as best she can, you know, with knowing that, like, if she were to get maybe the $40 million out of the Hilton Garden Inn, then it would mean getting, you know, putting, I don't know, like what's Gus and Ruby's out of business, you know, like, so it's Macro Polo, you know, so she does do that, you know, nuance, but we get hurt because we're not able to get the Hilton Garden Inns that could pay more versus the, you know, the Macro Polo that define Portsmouth but maybe can't.
Yep.
All right, I want to be cognizant of everybody's time. Jane, thank you, our senior assistant city attorney. If we can, we'll have a meeting scheduled for a time between the
11th and 15th.
the 11th and 15th, and we will work to deliver to the delegation, yourself included, Representative Muse, a list of bills that we would like to have a ability to further amend in the future by, let's try to do that by September 7th. And we'll meet after the filing period is.
And just so you know, on the 14th and 15th, I have retained bill committee hearings in Concord that are going to be all-day work sessions.
Oh, so we're thinking, so we want to see like when they start trickling back in. So it'll be 2 weeks after, it would be at the end of September likely that we would meet again.
Okay,
for-
and then from the 1st to the 14th, I'm actually going to Egypt. So-
Oh, lovely.
Goodness.
Where are you going? Oh, so where are you going in Egypt? You going on one of those Nile cruises?
That's part of it. It's with a company called Road Scholar.
Oh, yeah.
They're
It's a
like
great company.
Yeah, it's like a nonprofit, and what they do is which is a great way to go because it's a lot less,
Yep.
and you stay in the same places and go on the same ships as you would if you took a tour with Smithsonian or one of the other tour companies. But you know, for what you get, I mean, you're seeing, you know, Cairo, the Egyptian Museum, going through the Coptic quarter of Cairo, and I mean, it's like not just like the ancient Egyptian stuff, but a lot of modern day Egypt things, and then going to Abu Simbel and places like that. I mean, you really do see Lake Nasser. You really get a pretty good overview of the whole country, and it's been kind of like a bucket list thing. And when you get to be my age, you know, it's like you start to. And you're up in Concord.
Yeah.
It's like
We appreciate all the work you do. You deserve to go.
have something to look forward
Yeah.
to.
It'd be excellent. Well, enjoy the trip, and I'd wait a motion to adjourn.
So moved?
Second?
All in favor? Aye. Thank you, Representative Muse.